Good morning, everyone. Today I want to step back from the day-to-day strike counts coming out of the Middle East and talk about the single most powerful conventional weapon the United States has actually used in this entire war with Iran. The GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, better known as the Bunker Buster. This bomb has now been used in combat against Iran, and understanding exactly what it is, what it actually did, and what its limits are tells you something important about where this conflict can still go, especially with the Strait of Hormuz standoff still boiling over as we speak. So let's go through this properly, and let's be honest about what's confirmed, what's disputed, and what's simply not known yet. Start with what the GBU-57 actually is, because the numbers alone are almost hard to process. It's a 30,000-pound class precision-guided bomb built by Boeing, measuring just over 20 feet long. It pairs a hardened steel warhead with a GPS and inertial navigation guidance package that lets it hit within meters of its intended target. The entire point of this weapon is to destroy things that ordinary bombs simply cannot reach. Deeply buried, heavily fortified underground facilities like command bunkers, weapons labs, and reinforced enrichment halls. According to the Air Force, it's designed to punch through roughly 200 feet of earth, or something on the order of 60 feet of reinforced concrete, before a specialized delayed fuse finally triggers the explosion. That delay matters enormously because you need an explosive that won't detonate immediately under the sheer shock and pressure of punching through that much rock and steel. The entire weapon is engineered around surviving its own impact long enough to actually reach where it's going before it goes off. There's only one aircraft in the entire Air Force inventory capable of carrying and dropping this bomb, the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, which will eventually be joined by its successor, the B-21 Raider. Each B-2 can carry a maximum of 2 of these bombs at a time, which tells you just how limited and precious this specific strike capability actually is. These aren't weapons you load onto a fighter jet or fire from a ship. They require a purpose-built, long-range stealth bomber that can fly deep into contested airspace, survive some of the most sophisticated air defenses in the world, and still reach the target with enough precision to matter. Let's go back to the first time this weapon was ever used in actual combat, because it happened against Iran, and it set the template for everything that followed. In the early hours of June 22nd, 2025, in an operation the Pentagon named Operation Midnight Hammer, 7 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, each carrying 2 GBU-57s, struck Iran's Fordo uranium enrichment plant and its Natanz nuclear facility. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff confirmed at a Pentagon briefing that over a 25-minute window, a total of 14 bunker busters were dropped across those 2 target areas, while a U.S. submarine simultaneously launched roughly 30 Tomahawk cruise missiles at a third site, the Isfahan nuclear facility, which didn't require the same underground penetrating capability. The initial battle damage assessment described extremely severe damage and destruction at all 3 sites, though officials were careful to note that a full, final assessment would take considerably longer to complete. The tactical details of how that strike was carried out are genuinely remarkable, which is part of why this operation is still studied as one of the most complex airstrikes in modern military history. At Fordo specifically, the B-2 crews didn't simply drop bombs on top of the facility and hope for the best. 6 penetrators were dropped in rapid succession down each of 2 separate ventilation shafts, essentially using those shafts as a weak point to drill progressively deeper into the mountain with each successive bomb, rather than trying to punch straight through solid rock and reinforced concrete from the surface. A 12th bomb served as a deliberate backup in case any of the primary weapons failed. American intelligence analysts had reportedly been grappling with the specific challenge of how to destroy Fordo since Iran began building the facility inside a mountain back in 2006, meaning this single strike represented the culmination of nearly 2 decades of American planning and weapons development aimed at exactly this target. The broader mission architecture around the bombers themselves gives you a sense of how much had to go right. The full operation reportedly involved well over 100 aircraft in total, including refueling tankers, 4th-generation fighters, F-35s, and F-22s, all coordinated to clear a path into Iranian airspace using deception tactics, fighter sweeps, and suppression fires specifically designed so the B-2s themselves would face no shots fired at them directly. That's the real value proposition of this entire weapon system. The GBU-57 is genuinely just the final tool in a much longer chain that starts with years of intelligence work mapping out what's underground, continues through stealth platforms capable of surviving dense modern air defenses, and finishes with escort and suppression aircraft managing whatever residual threat remains, all just to create the conditions where 2 irreplaceable bombers can get close enough to drop their payload. Now here's where it gets genuinely complicated, and where it's important to be honest rather than declare total victory. Fordo's underground halls sit somewhere around 80 to 90 meters below the surface. an extraordinary depth for any penetrating weapon to guarantee full destruction against. Independent analysts have pointed out that Iranian-produced concrete and the surrounding rock at these sites can, in places, exceed the compressive strength the Massive Ordnance Penetrator was originally designed and tested against, and that a weapon punching through irregular hardened material can deflect or yaw slightly on the way down, throwing off exactly where and how deep it penetrates before detonating. None of that means the strike failed. Official assessments described extremely severe damage at all 3 sites. But it does mean there's real, credible technical debate among independent analysts about whether the underlying facilities were completely destroyed or simply very badly damaged. And satellite imagery alone can't fully answer that question from the surface, especially for a target sitting nearly the length of a football field underground. That uncertainty becomes directly relevant again when you look at what actually happened after Midnight Hammer, because this war didn't end there, and this is where the story gets bigger than a single strike on a single night. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated air campaign against Iran, publicly named Operation Epic Fury, targeting military facilities, nuclear-linked sites, and senior leadership. That operation resulted in the death of Iran's supreme leader, and it triggered a much wider war than the single-night strike the previous June. Iran responded with missile barrages against Israeli cities and American bases across the Gulf, in the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain. And the conflict spread further, drawing in Iran-backed Hezbollah rocket fire into Israel and Israeli counterstrikes into Lebanon. Iran declared the Strait of Hormuz closed on March 4th. And from that point on, shipping through one of the most important oil and gas choke points on the planet collapsed to a fraction of its normal volume. So when we talk about the war with Iran right now in July of 2026, we're not talking about a single isolated bunker buster strike anymore. We're talking about a 5-month-old still active war that Midnight Hammer only opened the door to. Inside that larger war, the combined American and Israeli air campaign kept returning to Iran's nuclear-adjacent infrastructure, and that included repeated strikes on the Parchin military complex southeast of Tehran, a sprawling site with a long history tied to Iran's pre-2003 covert weapons program. One specific building inside Parchin, known as Talagan 2, deserves its own explanation, because its story captures almost everything complicated about this fight. Talagan 2 was originally built during Iran's so-called Ahmad Plan in the early 2000s as a facility for high explosive testing directly relevant to nuclear weapons detonation physics. Israel struck it once already, back in October 2024, and satellite monitoring groups then tracked Iran quietly, rebuilding it afterward, eventually encasing the reconstructed structure in a thick concrete shell and burying it under fresh soil. A deliberate, months-long hardening effort that told analysts Iran understood exactly what kind of weapon it was trying to defend against. That hardening didn't save the site. On March 11th and 12th, 2026, strikes hit Talagan 2 again, leaving 3 confirmed impact craters visible in satellite imagery. And here's an important correction to how this story sometimes gets told. This was not an ambiguous US versus Israel puzzle. The Israeli Defense Forces publicly confirmed they carried out the strike, describing Talagan 2 as a site tied to advancing nuclear weapons capabilities and to explosives work connected to the old Ahmad program, and framing it as part of a broader campaign they called Operation Like a Lion, aimed at continuing to damage Iran's nuclear ambitions. Independent monitoring organizations that studied the strike noted the weapon used did not appear to be an American GBU-57, since Israel doesn't operate the B-2 bomber required to carry one. Israel had, in fact, already used its own earth-penetrating weapons earlier in the war against underground halls at Natanz, before the American strike on the hall containing the centrifuges. So rather than a lingering mystery about which country dropped which bomb, the honest picture is that Israel has its own, smaller class of bunker-penetrating munitions that it has used repeatedly and independently throughout this conflict, working alongside, but separately from, the much larger American GBU-57. And Talagan 2's story didn't end in March either. Satellite imagery gathered through June and into early July of 2026 showed Iran was already back at the site, clearing debris, temporarily covering the impact holes, and then moving into a more permanent phase of repair, pouring new concrete, reinforcing corners of the structure, and preparing to reseal the penetration points with rebar and a fresh concrete cap before eventually reburying the whole thing under earth again. Independent analysts describe this as at least the second attempt Iran has made to rebuild this specific facility since it was first destroyed in 2024. And it's a clear signal, arriving in real time, that Iran is treating the underlying capability as something worth rebuilding no matter how many times it gets hit. That pattern, strike, rebuild, harden, strike again, is probably the single most important thing to understand about this entire fight, because it's exactly the dynamic that shapes what the Pentagon is doing next, which I'll get to shortly. It's worth pausing on Israel's own role in this story a bit longer, because it's easy to collapse the bunker buster into a single American weapon and miss how much of the underground target problem this war has actually forced two separate air forces to solve in parallel. Israel does not operate the B-2 and cannot carry the GBU-57, so everything it has done against deeply buried Iranian facilities has relied on its own, smaller class of penetrating munitions, delivered by fighter aircraft rather than a dedicated stealth bomber. That's a meaningfully different capability profile. Israeli jets can generate far more sorties, far more often, than the tiny fleet of available B-2s ever could. But each individual Israeli penetrator carries a fraction of the mass and depth capability of the American bomb. What that's meant in practice over the course of this war is a kind of division of labor, whether or not it was ever formally planned that way. Israel has been able to return again and again to targets like Parchin and Taligan II, hitting them repeatedly as Iran rebuilds, because its munitions and aircraft are simply more available for that kind of sustained campaign. The GBU-57, by contrast, gets reserved for the handful of targets, like the deepest halls at Fordo, that nothing else in either country's arsenal can plausibly reach. Understanding that division helps explain why you see so many more strikes attributed to Israeli aircraft over the life of this war than to American B-2 sorties, even though the American bomb gets most of the public attention. It's also worth explaining briefly why Taligan II in particular became such a recurring flashpoint rather than a one-time target. The site's history goes back to Iran's Ahmad Plan, the covert nuclear weapons research effort from the early 2000s that Iran has always publicly denied was a weapons program at all. Taligan II originally housed a specialized high-explosive test chamber paired with diagnostic equipment capable of studying the physics of an explosive shockwave in extraordinary detail, the kind of experiment that has essentially no civilian application and every application to designing the conventional explosive package that would sit around a nuclear core. International inspectors have raised questions about the site for over a decade without ever fully resolving them, partly because Iran conducted an extensive multi-year cleanup of the location starting around 2011, well before any of the recent strikes, making it much harder for outside analysts to say with confidence what equipment might or might not still be inside. That long, murky history is exactly why satellite imagery showing Iran quietly reinforcing and reburying the site, first after the 2024 strike, and again after the March 2026 strike, reads as significant to people who track this program closely. It's not just a bombed building being repaired the way you'd fix a factory. It's a site with a documented weapons-relevant history being rebuilt behind a thicker shell each time, which is precisely the kind of pattern that keeps this specific location in the crosshairs of both Israeli and American planners. Let's also talk briefly about what this week's naval escalation tells you about how this war is evolving on a completely different front, because the Strait of Hormuz fight has developed its own separate technological story that's worth understanding on its own terms, even setting the bunker buster question aside entirely. The shift toward using autonomous strike vessels, the Corsair unmanned surface vessels deployed by Central Command this past weekend against a submarine and maintenance facility at Bandar Abbas, mirrors a pattern that's played out elsewhere in the world over the past few years, most visibly in Ukraine's use of naval drones to push Russia's Black Sea fleet out of Crimea and back toward its own coastline. The appeal of this kind of weapon is straightforward. A 24-foot autonomous boat with a meaningful payload and range can approach a heavily defended port without putting a single American sailor at risk. And if it's lost in the attempt, the cost is a fraction of what a crewed vessel or aircraft would represent. The fact that the same type of drone boat had, just weeks earlier, been used to rescue downed American aviators rather than to attack anything shows how quickly this technology is being folded into a much broader set of missions beyond simple reconnaissance. None of that changes the underground target problem that GBU-57 and its successor are built to solve, but it does tell you this war is generating rapid capability development across multiple domains at once, not just in the world of massive penetrating bombs. It's also worth touching on the economic backdrop, because the strategic value of a weapon like the GBU-57 doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's inseparable from what's actually at stake in the Strait of Hormuz itself. Before this war began, roughly a fifth of the world's seaborne oil trade and a similar share of global liquefied natural gas shipments passed through that narrow waterway every single day. When Iran declared it closed and began mining, boarding, and striking vessels attempting to transit it, tanker traffic collapsed to a small fraction of pre-war levels, and thousands of mariners found themselves effectively stranded in the Gulf for extended stretches, while diplomats tried to negotiate safe quarters. Every time this conflict flares back up, as it has this month, oil markets react almost immediately, with benchmark crude prices posting some of their sharpest single-day moves in years. That's the backdrop against which any renewed nuclear facility strike would have to be weighed. A bunker buster campaign against Fordo or a rebuilt Taligan II doesn't happen in isolation from the shipping war playing out in the Strait. The two are tightly linked in the minds of planners on every side, because Iran's leverage over global energy flows is precisely the kind of pressure it can apply in retaliation for exactly the kind of strike we've spent this whole discussion walking through. Let's talk about the aftermath of the original Midnight Hammer strike specifically, because this is a genuinely underreported and legitimately concerning thread. Iran's government has publicly warned that strikes on its nuclear facilities created serious dangers, including the possibility of radiation exposure, a concern that carries real weight given that these bunker-busting weapons are specifically engineered to detonate deep underground, often close to enrichment halls and other reactor-adjacent infrastructure. Because the GBU-57 relies on fuse timing calibrated to an expected penetration depth, any mismatch between the weapon's expected performance and the actual density of the surrounding rock and concrete can, in theory, produce a fuse malfunction or an unexpected impact angle. Some post-war reporting has raised the possibility, without fully confirming it, that a number of the bombs dropped during Midnight Hammer may not have detonated as intended and could remain lodged somewhere inside the underground structures at Fordo or Natanz. I want to be careful here, because that specific claim is speculative and has not been conclusively verified by independent, on-the-ground inspection. Nobody currently has access to confirm it either way. But if it turned out to be true even partially, it would create a genuinely difficult secondary problem that has nothing to do with the original strike's tactical success or failure. Because undetonated ordnance of that scale sitting inside a nuclear enrichment facility would make any post-strike inspection, repair, or decontamination work exceptionally dangerous for anyone who tries to access the site, whether that's Iranian engineers or international nuclear inspectors. It's worth remembering that Iran's own parliament passed a law barring international inspectors from visiting any site that had already been struck. And while Iran has framed that decision mainly as political leverage in nuclear negotiations, the possibility of unexploded ordnance would give Tehran an additional, genuinely plausible safety justification, layered on top of whatever political motivations are also clearly in play. There's also a real strategic risk buried in this specific problem, in a more literal sense than usual. Unexploded ordnance of this sophistication would represent an enormous intelligence and technology transfer opportunity if it were ever recovered and studied. The GBU-57's hardened casing, its delayed fuse mechanism, its guidance architecture, and its penetration physics represent some of the most advanced bunker-busting engineering the United States has ever fielded, and any adversary or intelligence service that gained access to even a partially intact unit would learn a great deal about exactly how it works. That's speculative again, but it's the kind of downside risk that makes this more than a simple story of a successful strike. Let's talk about what all of this has cost, and what it tells you about how seriously the Pentagon takes replenishing this specific capability. Boeing is the only company that manufactures the GBU-57, and the Air Force has justified sole source contracts to restock it on the grounds that any delay in replenishment would directly undermine military readiness. Reported contract figures for replacement components, tail kits, fuse hardware, and containers expended during Midnight Hammer have run into the tens of millions of dollars, with separate contracts specifically for replenishing the bomb bodies themselves running well beyond that. Some of the delivery timelines on replacement components reportedly stretch out toward the end of this decade, which tells you just how limited and slow to produce this weapon actually is, even for a country with America's industrial capacity. Air Force documentation has described the restocking effort as critically needed to restore strategic contingency plans across every geographic combatant command, not just the one currently fighting Iran, which tells you this capability is viewed as core, irreplaceable strategic infrastructure, not a one-off weapon expended in a single fight. And that brings us to a genuinely forward-looking detail worth knowing, because it tells you the Pentagon doesn't consider even the GBU-57 to be the final word on this problem. In June 2026, the Air Force formally designated its planned successor to the Massive Ordnance Penetrator as the GBU-76, also called the Next Generation Penetrator, and put out a formal solicitation seeking industry partners to help design, build, test, and sustain it. That program didn't come from nowhere. The Air Force had already awarded a contract the previous September to a defense engineering firm working alongside Boeing to produce an early prototype, building on earlier requirements, work going back to 2024. The new weapon is expected to have a warhead in the neighborhood of 22,000 pounds, lighter than the current bomb, while still combining blast, fragmentation, and penetration effects in a single weapon. And it's reportedly being designed with an alternate navigation system, so it can still hit its target accurately, even if GPS is jammed, spoofed, or unavailable, a real concern in any future conflict against an adversary actively trying to disrupt American precision guidance systems. Some reporting suggests the Air Force has requested well over $100 million in this fiscal year alone to keep the program moving, with prototype demonstrations expected sometime around fiscal year 2027 or 2028, depending on the source. The lighter weight also matters for another reason. It could eventually let the B-21 Raider, the B-2's smaller and more numerous successor, carry more than one of these penetrators at a time, something the current bomb doesn't easily allow given the B-21's reduced size relative to the B-2. Even America's most powerful conventional bunker-busting bomb is already being treated as a weapon that needs a successor, specifically because adversaries like Iran keep adapting their underground construction techniques almost as fast as American penetrator technology improves, which is exactly the pattern we just walked through with Taliban II's repeated cycle of destruction and reconstruction. It's also worth knowing that the Air Force is separately developing a nuclear-armed, deep-penetrating weapon concept, intended for the small number of targets that even an improved conventional penetrator might not be able to reach, which underlines just how seriously planners take the possibility that some buried facilities may simply be beyond the reach of any conventional bomb, however large. So let's connect all of this history back to right now, to this week specifically, because it's directly relevant to where the current escalation could still go. Iran declared the Strait of Hormuz closed again in mid-July after its Revolutionary Guard forces attacked commercial shipping, including strikes on tankers, and after a ceasefire framework that had briefly stabilized the region since April effectively collapsed. The United States has responded with multiple rounds of conventional strikes this month, hitting well over 100 targets in a single night on more than one occasion, reimposing a naval blockade on Iranian ports, and floating the idea of a toll on ships passing through the strait, an idea that had actually been publicly rejected by American diplomats only weeks earlier before the president raised it again. Just this past weekend, American forces used Corsair unmanned surface vessels, small autonomous attack boats, to strike a submarine and ship maintenance facility at Iran's Bandar Abbas naval base, marking the first time American forces have used sea drones in actual combat operations, a milestone U.S. Central Command confirmed directly. Oil markets have reacted sharply to all of this, with benchmark crude prices posting some of their largest single-day gains in years as traders price in the risk of a fully reopened war over the strait. Nothing in this specific week's escalation, as of this recording, indicates a new GBU-57 bunker-buster strike against Iran's nuclear facilities has happened. What's confirmed, across the full arc of this war, is that the GBU-57 was used against Fordo and Natanz during Operation Midnight Hammer in June of last year, that the wider war expanded dramatically at the end of February this year, with Operation Epic Fury and the death of Iran's supreme leader, that Israel independently struck the Taliban II facility at Parchin in March using its own earth-penetrating weapons, rather than the American bomb, and that Iran has continued trying to repair and re-harden that same site as recently as this month. Why does that distinction matter for understanding where things go from here? Because if the current standoff over shipping in the Strait continues to fail diplomatically, and if intelligence indicates Iran is once again trying to rebuild or harden any part of its nuclear program the way it clearly has at Taliban II, the GBU-57 remains the one weapon in the American arsenal specifically built, tested, and already proven in combat against exactly that kind of target. The Pentagon's continued investment in replenishing that capability and its parallel development of an entirely new successor penetrator tells you Washington isn't treating the underground nuclear target problem as solved or closed. It's treating it as an ongoing technical competition against an adversary that keeps adapting. Which means if this current standoff over shipping and the Strait ever escalates back toward a renewed nuclear facilities campaign, the infrastructure, the doctrine, and the physical bombs needed to strike those targets again are already sitting ready, tested, and paid for. It's also worth being honest about the human and environmental stakes layered underneath all of this, because it's easy to talk about penetration depths and concrete strength and lose sight of what's actually at risk. Iran's government has publicly flagged the possibility of radiation exposure tied to strikes on facilities that handle enriched uranium, and there remain open, unresolved questions about whether any unexploded ordnance sits inside these sites right now, creating an ongoing hazard for anyone who eventually has to go in and assess or repair the damage. Whatever you think about the strategic necessity of these strikes, the physical reality of dropping 30,000-pound penetrating weapons into facilities that process nuclear material carries risks that don't simply end the moment the bomb detonates or fails to detonate deep underground. Let's bring this to a close with the honest, complete picture, corrections and all. The GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator is the most powerful conventional bunker-busting weapon in the American arsenal, a 30,000-pound precision bomb that can only be delivered by the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, and it has been used in actual combat exactly once so far, in the 14-bomb strike on Fordo and Natanz during Operation Midnight Hammer in June 2025. The war it helped open didn't stay contained to that single night. It expanded dramatically at the end of February 2026 into a much broader U.S.-Israel campaign that killed Iran's supreme leader and triggered the Strait of Hormuz closures that have shaped the regional economy ever since. And it has continued through repeated Israeli and American strikes on nuclear-adjacent sites like Taliban 2, which Iran keeps trying to rebuild almost as fast as it gets destroyed. Independent experts remain genuinely divided on exactly how completely the original Midnight Hammer strike destroyed the underlying Fordo and Natanz facilities, given their extraordinary depth and hardened construction. And there are credible, though not fully confirmed, concerns about unexploded ordnance and radiation risk that complicate any simple declaration of total success. The Pentagon's own procurement decisions, replenishing GBU-57 stockpiles at real cost while simultaneously developing an entirely new successor weapon in the GBU-76, tell you Washington views this as an unfinished, ongoing technical challenge rather than a solved problem. And while this week's escalation over the Strait of Hormuz has so far involved conventional strikes, a naval blockade, and the first combat use of American sea drones rather than a new bunker buster mission, the capability, the doctrine, and the proven track record against exactly this kind of target remain fully available if this standoff ever pulls the nuclear question back to the center of the conflict. What I'd watch for going forward is whether satellite monitoring organizations identify any new hardening efforts at other Iranian nuclear-adjacent sites, the way they've now tracked twice at Taliban 2, since that pattern has proven to be one of the clearest early indicators of where the next potential bunker buster target might eventually be. I'd also watch whether any additional verifiable reporting emerges confirming or denying the unexploded ordnance concerns at Fordo and Natanz, since that has real implications for both nuclear safety and for what Iran can credibly claim about its own inspection restrictions. And I'd keep an eye on the GBU-76 Next Generation Penetrator program specifically, because a successful prototype demonstration in the next year or two would tell you the Pentagon is actively preparing for a future where even the current bunker buster isn't considered sufficient against whatever Iran or any other adversary building deeply buried facilities builds next. That's the fuller, corrected picture of America's bunker buster campaign against Iran, drawn from Pentagon briefings, independent satellite imagery analysis from groups like the Institute for Science and International Security, and reporting from outlets including CNN, Reuters, Al Jazeera, the Associated Press, and Specialist Defense Press. I've tried to give you both the genuine scale of what this weapon has accomplished and the honest technical and political uncertainty that still surrounds it, rather than declaring total, unambiguous victory the way a headline alone might suggest. This is one thread of the Iran war that is far from fully resolved, and given how quickly things are moving around the Strait of Hormuz right now, it's very much still being written. If you want to keep following how this specific piece of the war develops, especially if the current standoff over shipping ever pulls the nuclear question back into the center of the conversation, keep watching the same handful of indicators we've walked through today. New construction or hardening at Iranian nuclear-adjacent sites, any movement on the GBU-76 program's prototype timeline, and any credible independently verified reporting on the condition of Fordo and Natanz that goes beyond satellite photography alone. Those three threads, taken together, are probably the clearest early warning system available for where this conflict goes next.